Many Christians struggle to defend the truth of the Christian worldview. But what if there's a podcast dedicated to answering the toughest objections to Christianity? That's the mission of the Daily Apologist podcast. On this episode, I continue my discussion with New Testament scholar and historian Craig A. Evans on the passion narratives contained in the Gospels. So let's move down the line. I think that's a great explanation to some of the other pieces to this passion narrative that ultimately lead to the death and burial of Jesus. The other popular thing that I hear in the circles that I run with when I have interactions with skeptics about the historicity of the passion scene, the historicity of Jesus' burial, really centers around not just whether or not he was buried, but this figure that appears out of nowhere in the Gospels by the name of Joseph of Arimathea. And so one of the first question that I want to ask is, what historically do we know about Joseph of Arimathea? And then the next question that comes after that is, where in the world is Arimathea?
Yeah, good question. Arimathea could be Abu Ghosh today. It's the right distance that's actually given. The manuscript evidence, some manuscripts give a lengthier number of stadia further away, and that's what leads to the traditional Nicopolis, which is also called Arimathea, and I've visited it. And of course, the people there are so proud, and they insist they have a sign. This is the real, Arimathea. And so forth. But the it's possible. We don't know. We don't know. By the way, there are many, many villages. We don't know where they are. They're mentioned by Josephus. We don't know where they are. There are some villages mentioned in the Gospels. We're not sure. Um, there are three possible locations for Cana of Galilee. We don't know where Emmaus is. It's in that Arimathea unknown section. We just don't know. But just because we don't have absolute full knowledge of every village and where every village was in antiquity, that doesn't it's not a vote against anything. That's just the way it is, whether we're talking about ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Macedonia, it doesn't matter. They're just things like that we don't know. The real question is, okay, is this story a pious fiction? Did Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, a member of the council, did he go to Pilate and request permission to bury Jesus's body? Well, I think it's extremely likely. All four Gospels talk about it, so we don't have some kind of a bifurcation or division on that information there. The other thing is, if you know your Jewish tradition, your Jewish laws, if the Sanhedrin condemns somebody to death, that person is condemned to a dishonorable burial. Now, it's burial. You're not going to defile the land and leave him unburied, which is very dishonorable. No, he's to be buried. Nobody can publicly weep at the tomb. They can't go through lamentation and wailing and so on. So he's quietly buried, and he's not buried in a place of honor. He can't be buried in the family tomb or some other noble burial place. It has to be a tomb for criminals and for this purpose. And our ancient sources talk about this. But the interesting thing is it falls to the Sanhedrin. If they condemn somebody and the family is denied participation, it falls to the Sanhedrin to bury him. That's exactly what the Gospels do. And that's why Joseph, one of the few who didn't condemn Jesus, he offers to bury Jesus because he cares. And so that's why he shows up in all four Gospels. I don't think there's any doubt he's a historical character. The other reason you can argue for that is if that's a lie and it's simply untrue that Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the council, did not do this, that could be so easily found out because it'd be like saying a U.S. senator. It was Chuck Schumer who did such and such. Well, if
Well,
he didn't do that, people would know.
one of the things that I think about when I look at that narrative of Joseph of Arimathea is that this isn't just some uh, Joe Blow, pun intended, Joe Blow off the street. This is a member of the Sanhedrin, prominent men in the Jewish culture, and everybody would have known who this guy was. And so the idea that it was an invention that could have easily been um, that could have easily been denied because somebody could have come along and just said, "Listen, these guys over here saying that Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus. There never even existed a guy named Joseph of Arimathea." And
Yeah, not only that, Dean, John's gospel introduces Nicodemus,
mhm,
and he's a ranking known person, a teacher of Israel. Well, that is a dangerous, reckless embellishment if there's no truth behind that. So that's
yeah,
why as a historian, I say, yeah, that's most likely. By the way, most historians would agree the Sanhedrin was obligated to bury the people they condemned.
mhm.
And so you expect somebody. So who is Joseph Arimathea? Other than burying Jesus, he's nobody. And so where's the real, advantage? Let's pull the name out of the hat. Well, who's Joseph Arimathea?
Yeah.
He's nobody. And
So
so his
yeah,
name is pulled out of the hat simply because he is the guy. What you see are the Gospels are doing their best to show how sympathetic he was.
mhm,
That's what they're working on, not the fact that he was the one that did it.
mhm. So the other piece that this skeptic, I'll put my skeptic hat on here for a second, and I'll say, okay, Doctor Evans, you're telling me that all four Gospels, record, that Josephus of Arimathea. We don't know necessarily where that is. There are three possible places for that, um, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to be one source because, according to most scholars, Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark, so they're not independent sources. And then you've got John over here, who is separate from the synoptics, but all of that is contained within the Bible. Isn't that just using the Bible to prove the Bible?
There's such an anachronism when I hear that. And in the first century, did anybody know that was the Bible? We have four first century biographies. Then they get adapted, changed, supplemented subtly or wildly in the second and third century. So we end up with some more gospels. We end up with about 3 dozen by the time we get to the end of the. I don't know where Dan Brown got his 85 in Da Vinci Code, but you end up with about 3 dozen or so gospels by the end of the third century. And so the four ones that are early, based on early sources that are lost to us, the four first century gospels all say the same thing. Pilate condemned Jesus to the cross. Joseph of Arimathea buried him. John adds Nicodemus, as I said. So he's upping the ante a little bit. And so you have, and by the way, as far as sources go, Luke, most agree there's some kind of proto Luke, which is why he omits chunks of Mark's narrative. So you have Luke dependent upon not just Mark, as Matthew is also, but not as heavily as Matthew. And Luke seems to know a parallel narrative source in addition to all of Jesus's teaching that Matthew and Luke have in common that we usually call Q. So you actually have Mark and this proto Luke, whatever you want to call it, that then Luke and Matthew like and make use of, and that's an endorsement that's important. It's a first century endorsement of those earlier sources. And then you have John, who's independent. So you have at least two, maybe three independent first century sources that all say the same thing that could be seriously embarrassed and contradicted if it was simply false.
Mhm.
Either where people say, that isn't true, the Sanhedrin doesn't do that. Well, no, they're not going to say that because the Sanhedrin does do that, as the Jewish sources themselves say. And then, of course, if Joseph of Arimathea, mentioned by all four Gospels, had nothing to do with it, there's village memory. Everybody in Arimathea remembers Joseph, even if he's dead by the time the Gospels circulate. His children and grandchildren remember him. And they'd say, "What are you talking about? He thought Jesus was a fraud. He had no such sympathy." That would be there. It embarrassed the church. It would force a revision. And so, no, it's known. And the continuity of village memory is a very important thing in understanding these gospels. Not like today, where people live 6 months there, a year there, and then move and they go to another state. Most people grew up in a certain village and lived there their whole lives. And that's why there's this continuity. There's no question that the house at Capernaum, that's the house where Peter stayed with Jesus, the house of his mother in law. There's no doubt about that because it went from private house to public meeting place in the first century. There's not a chance in the world that people in the first century would be unable to remember which house it was here in Capernaum that the famous teacher stayed in.
Yeah.
So we need to stop thinking like modern people who have no roots, no memory, no sense of history, because that's not the way it was in the first century.
So, and the point of and one of the points that am trying to uncover with that type of statement is the idea that in order for things in the Gospels or in the Bible to be historical, the skeptic says, well, you have to have extra biblical sources to back up what's said in the Bible. Is that necessarily true? So, like, if we lump Matthew, Mark, and Luke into one category as, say, source A, right? Let's just give the skeptic what they want. All of these are just source A.
Okay.
And then you have John over here that attests to what is recorded over here with regards to the burial. My question is, and this is often what I ask my skeptical friends, isn't that good enough?
Well, of course it is. Of course it is. If you talk to anybody who's dealing with history, they're usually profoundly grateful if they have one source. And if they have two, that's a bonus. And if the two sources or even the one source also coheres with topography, geography, and archaeology, they take it to the bank. And so historians of classical Rome, Greece, and so on, they shake their heads at the skepticism in the New Testament world and the ridiculous demands for additional evidence and more proof, and on it goes.
Why do you think that is, Dr.
Oh,
Adams? Why?
the only way I can explain it is a theological answer.
Mm-hmm.
The stakes are huge, and the skepticism that targets Jesus, the most extreme of which is mythicism.
Yeah.
Jesus didn't even exist. To me, that's a left-handed compliment because what they're really saying is it's all about Jesus. He's the game changer. And if you don't want it his way, then you do crazy things. You just fry your brain and say he didn't exist, or we need 15 sources, two or three aren't enough. You go goo goo gaga. And you do what no classical historian would do.
Yeah.
Nobody else who works in the ancient Near East or whatever. But when it comes to Jesus, people can get funny.
Yeah. The other question that I have that's not actually on my list, one of the things that gets raked over the coals when we're talking about the burial narratives of Jesus and just in general about establishing the reliability of the gospels, the reliability of the New Testament, is this thing called criteria of embarrassment. And clearly the idea that a member of the Sanhedrin would bury Jesus seems to be something that would be embarrassing for the church going forward to have to admit. Now, a couple of points I'd like for you to elaborate on is how strong and how much should lay Christians or apologists really weigh the criteria of embarrassment as a evidence for the reliability of the Gospels, New Testament burial of Jesus?
Well, I think it definitely is a factor that comes into play. Some people think that they try to cancel out the criterion of embarrassment. And criteria are tools, and in the words of Dale Allison, tools are only as good as the hands that hold them. And so there are various criteria. So let's talk about the burial of Jesus. Let's talk about the specific question of Joseph Arimathea. Well, what criteria come into play here? Well, okay, there's temporal proximity. The gospel accounts are written within a generation. They're not written 200 years after the event, they're written within a generation. Living eyewitnesses are still alive. So there's temporal proximity. Real historians are concerned with that. How close to the events is my source, or are my sources? The second thing is, do I have two or more sources? That's multiple attestation. So okay, so now we have two. We're close, and we have at least two, maybe three. Good. Then there's what's called verisimilitude. And that's why the archaeologists do make use of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts and Josephus, because the sources reflect the realities of that time, as we know from other sources, as we know from archaeology itself. And then, of course, nothing like, the proof is in the tasting, the proof of the pudding.
Yeah.
And so they say, okay, let's follow Matthew or Mark or Luke or whatever. Let's dig here. Let's see what we find. Shazam. It fits. It makes sense. Thanks to, now I know, thanks to what John says or what Luke says, that's what this is. It all makes sense. It all fits together. So there's verisimilitude. Historians are very concerned with that. Now, embarrassment comes in this particular case. You're right. On the one hand, Mark might not have given it any thought at all. Well, we all know Joseph Arimathea, like it or not, he's the one that buried Jesus. Okay. You're right, though. What's embarrassing here? The disciples ran away. That's awkward. These are Jesus's men. These are his closest followers. Even Peter, who preaches at the Pentecost sermon, the first pope, if you will. He says, I don't even know him. Who is this? I don't know what you're talking about.
The guy hours before who was chopping off ears.
I mean, so you look at that and think, nobody made this up. If you're going to make it up, make Peter into a hero. Oh, by the way, that's what happens in the 2nd century in a work called The Gospel of Peter. Yep. All of a sudden, the boys look good. And all these problems disappear. And you got hostile witnesses. Wow, they actually see the resurrection. And Jesus, who's a mile tall, comes out
with
of
a talking cross.
Yeah. Wow. But in the real Gospels in the 1st century, temporally proximate within a generation, the ones that exhibit verisimilitude, that isn't what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Disciples run away. That's embarrassing. So a fictional gospel likely would have very brave, pious disciples tending to their master as good disciples should. But they don't.
So along that line, then, where else? Let's maybe look extra biblically here, so that for the listeners, when they come across someone who says, well, criteria of embarrassment is only used for the people that are trying to, verify that the gospel records are reliable. Where else outside of the New Testament have scholars employed the criteria of embarrassment for historical figures, historical events, stuff like that?
It comes up from time to time in all sources about ancient figures. Like, we ask ourselves, is Suetonius being honest when he tells the history of this emperor or that emperor? Or Plutarch when he's telling the history of this person or that person? That question always comes up because usually the way it's put is not so much embarrassment as contrary to best interest, contrary to one's own interest. And you'll hear a scholar say, well, it's very likely that so-and-so is telling the truth because what he's telling, it does not reflect well on his friends or does not reflect well on himself. It is not in his best interest. And that's another way of talking about the criterion of embarrassment. So it's a perfectly acceptable criterion. The thing is, with gospel studies, the criteria have been sliced and diced and nuanced ad nauseum because there's such a high level of what I regard as unnecessary and unwarranted skepticism. So it's a huge burden of proof that's placed on the gospel scholar to say, "Oh, you need mountains of evidence. You need all kinds of criteria in order to show that just a small part of the story is likely true." And you don't find that when scholars are talking about Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. All of a sudden, the criteria are much softer and they come down. One source is enough. Hey, it was written within 100 years. That's close enough. We don't know where it happened, but I'm sure it did. But it's very different. But you get into the Gospels, and oh my goodness, if we can't identify precisely which spot, if we don't have 3 or 4 sources, if it isn't within 20 years, and it's a double standard.
So maybe a more, I guess what I'm asking is, from your position and your expertise, what are some of the examples that the layperson can use, when that charge is brought up about embarrassment, say, oh, well, hey, here's an embarrassing thing that scholars pointed to that confirms something about a figure of history. What are some, I guess what I'm saying, where else specifically is that criteria used in ancient history outside of the Gospels? Who could we point to and say, all right, well, here's a figure and here's a specific example of the criteria?
We could go with Alexander the Great, I suppose, because the tendency after his death is to lionize him to the point of even divinizing him. And yet, along the way, it will be admitted that he makes a mistake or acted rashly or hastily or blundered in some way. And don't ask me for specific examples. We'd have to just open up the text and start reading through it.
Yeah.
But I'm just, for your listeners, our listeners who are interested in that, that's what I would suggest you do. And you will see that in Suetonius and Plutarch when they talk about the Caesars and other great people. By the way, they typically are, more like 50 years, 80 years removed from them. And with Augustus, 100 years removed from him. But you will see that occasionally these details drop in that are contrary to best interest, contrary to the editorial perspective of the writer, or contrary to the portrait of the figure he's trying to present. And when historians see that, they go, he is making an effort to be objective, and in the passing along of the tradition, it's being passed along warts and all. So yeah, sure, there's lionizing. Oh, he's a great guy. Oh, he's brilliant. People were impressed. But it's what slips in is he makes some mistakes. He doesn't always get it right. He is criticized. And so that is a recognized, acceptable thing. But let me come back, 2 or 3 times, Dean, you've said, well, skeptics might say, yeah, but that's in the Bible. Please understand how naive and anachronistic that is. The Gospels are in the Bible now. They weren't in the Bible in the first century, not even in the second century. It's not till about 180 AD that Irenaeus emphatically says there are 4 Gospels and that's it. And I'm not sure that met with 100% consent at the end of the second century. So this idea that, well, there's nothing outside the Bible. What do you mean? What if Luke ended up being outside the Bible and it still was preserved? We'd be able to point to it and say, see, here's something outside the Bible. So just because all 4 of the first century Gospels got included in the New Testament shouldn't disqualify them. They didn't know that would happen. And the other thing, too, about fakers and forgers and scribes changing things, how did they know in the first and second centuries what would be included?
Yeah.
How would they know what Orthodox Christology was going to be? Is it going to be, let's make Jesus more human or less, more divine? How'd they know? Who in the second century knew what the Nicene Creed was going to be in 325? See, there's
That's
a
a good
lot
point.
of silliness and naivete and anachronism in these kinds of objections. People just don't. I debated a guy who said, "Well, if Jesus was so famous, why aren't more people talking about him other than Christians in the first century?" I mean, I just thought, "Oh, that's unbelievable." So, in other words, why doesn't Jesus have a fourth or fifth century AD reputation in the middle of the first century? Is really what they're saying. It was utterly naive.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that is going to be very beneficial to the listeners, and to be frank, that's beneficial to me when we're talking about um, criteria of embarrassment, because now what we can kind of show our skeptical friends, and even those skeptics who don't want to be our friends, is that this is a common use that is not just used to trump up the Gospels, to trump up the New Testament, but this is something that historians from day one use in order to show, in order to discover what's true and what's not true. So I'm glad that you've, mentioned, just the general scope of the criteria embarrassment, but also really nailed down some specifics with regards to that, so that when we come back to the burial of Jesus, we can look at this and we can say, all right, this burial narrative that is in all of the early biographies of Jesus, they don't shy away from the fact that a member of the Sanhedrin has buried Jesus. That would, for me, as a former Marine, that would be like saying, one of the presidents died, and and maybe I'm going a little bit too far on this, but we can edit it out anyway. One of the presidents died, and yeah, a member of the group who assassinated him buried him.
Yeah, I know, and that is a very good point. Another scholar wrote an article about the Gospel of Peter. We think it was written around 140, 150 A.D. And what he pointed out was the Gospel of Peter told the story the way people in the second century thought it should have been told in the first place. And so, of course, the emphasis there is more on resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, the criterion of embarrassment, if you want to apply it there, who discovers the empty tomb first? Women.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, in our egalitarian age, we lionize women. That the sting of that isn't very apparent. We'd think, well, so what? Okay, some women were there first, but in the first century, in Jewish audiences and Greco-Roman audiences, they think, oh, for Pete's sakes, and actual skeptics. We don't have to guess. We know this. Celsus, writing in the 170s. A couple generations later, Porphyry, they go crazy about that. They said, oh, for Pete's sakes, who sees this risen Jesus? A couple of hysterical women. Why, Jesus should have showed himself to the Romans and to the Sanhedrin. That's exactly what happens in the Gospel of Peter.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody's been
Very
listening to the
interesting.
critics and says,
Yeah.
yeah, let's tell this story again and get rid of the embarrassment. Let's tell it the way it ought to be told. But
With
see,
the
the gospel
yeah.
writers, the real ones in the first century, they're saying this is what happened.
Outstanding. Well, Dr. Evans, I wish that I could just talk to you for another 5 hours about this stuff. I find this stuff fascinating. But I know that your time is valuable. So what I'd like to do is just say, or ask one last question, and then I'll give you the last word. If you had to put a percentage of likelihood that Jesus was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea after his crucifixion, between 1 and 100% probability or certainty, let's just go certainty, where would you put that as an expert in this field?
That Jesus was buried after his execution, I would say, is 100%. That Joseph of Arimathea took the lead in doing that, I would put it at like 98 or 99, very, very close. Because there really isn't much advantage to picking his name out of the hat, but it's otherwise just say somebody in keeping with the law from the Sanhedrin. But to name him specifically puts you at risk of contradiction if it
Hmm.
isn't true.
Yeah.
Name
Well,
him and his city. Ooh.
yeah. So so just so that if listeners have enjoyed this conversation, which I'm sure they will, what works have you published that maybe you think would be great for the lay reader? Is there a website we can find you at? What events do you have coming up? Post. I mean, obviously COVID-19 is wiped a lot of those out, but what's coming up down the line that we can look forward to that you'd like to take this time to promote as we
Okay.
wrap up the show?
Well, thanks for that. Anybody can go to my website, CraigAEvans.com. And there is a page on my website that lists my books. Of these books, for lay readers, Jesus and His World, the archaeological evidence is probably best. It's paperback. It's not very expensive. Jesus and His World. If you're a sharp scholar and you're not afraid of Greek and Latin and Hebrew and so on, then the real technical version is Jesus and the Remains of His Day. I also have a book that will come out. It's in the press right now, and I think, unless the virus delays it, but it's supposed to come out in October or November. It's called Jesus and the Manuscripts. I forget the name of the subtitle. Anyway, it's supposed to come out, and it's going to look at Jesus in all of the early texts, Christian or otherwise. So Jewish, Islamic, Greco-Roman, texts inside the canon, outside the canon, and so on, everything, including the infancy narratives and things like that. And just to critically assess our manuscripts and what are our best sources and how do we evaluate all of them. So that's Jesus and the manuscripts.
Outstanding, and thank you once again for your time and your your ability to just make this specific quote issue or objection. Really did a superb job in the time that we've been together, just educating me, educating the listeners, both about burial, the Roman practice of crucifixion, things like that, and then also really handling some common objections that are out there. Appreciate you doing that for us. And for those of you who are listening, that wraps up our series on the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Between this episode and next week's episode, go ahead and check out the entire series on the resurrection. And remember to equip yourself to engage culture.